Hey guys, it's Mr. Collier. All right, today's the first installment of 3 chapters, and then next Tuesday we'll do 3 more, but Miss Emily is going to read those to you guys. So this one's called What? Chapter 17 is called What? And the crazy thing about this story is I literally have to read it backwards. So I start from the end of the chapter and go back, and I have to read paragraphs on top of each other. So if I get a little choppy, that's why. One day, Jenny was late for school. Her mother wouldn't let her leave the breakfast table until she finished her prune juice. It took her forever. She hated prune juice more than anything in the world. She finally got it all down and hurried as fast as she could to the bus stop. When she got there, the bus was pulling away. She sighed, then turned around and ran all the way back home. "I missed the bus," Jenny grumbled. "Put on your helmet," said her father. "I'll drive you to school on the back of my motorcycle." She put on her helmet. Then her father drove her to school on the back of his motorcycle. It was a very bumpy ride. She hopped off the back in front of Wayside School and charged up the stairs. Her stomach was still going up and down as she opened the door of Miss Jewell's room. Mrs. Jewell looked up from the story she had been reading to the class. "You're late," she said. Jenny caught her breath. "What?" she asked. She couldn't hear too well because she was still wearing the motorcycle helmet. "Why are you late?" asked Mrs. Jewell. "What?" asked Jenny. "Take off your helmet," said Mrs. Jewell. "I can't hear you. I better take off my helmet," said Jenny. She took it off. "Why are you late?" asked Mrs. Jewell. "Because I hate prune juice," Jenny griped. "What does prune juice have to do with anything?" asked Mrs. Jewell. "I couldn't leave the table until I finished it," explained Jenny, "and then I missed the bus." "Well, that's no excuse. Now go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline." Jenny wrote her name on the blackboard under the word discipline. Miss Jewell waited for Jenny to sit down. Jenny sat down. "And next time you'll drink your prune juice more quickly," said Mrs. Jewell. Jenny made a face. She could still taste the awful stuff. Mrs. Jewell looked back at the story she had been reading before Jenny's interruption. There was only one sentence left for her to read. She read it to the class. Everybody laughed except Jenny. Dana laughed hysterically. "There goes the giggle box," said Myron. That made Dana laugh even harder. "Why aren't you laughing, Jenny?" asked Mrs. Jewell. "Didn't you think that was a funny story?" "Well, all I heard was the last sentence," said Jenny. "It isn't funny unless you hear what happened first." "Good point. Here, you can read the book yourself. It's very funny." She gave it to Jenny. "But I already know how the story ends," Jenny complained. "I only like stories with surprise endings." "So read the story backwards," suggested Mrs. Jewell. "That way the beginning will be a surprise." "Okay," said Jenny. So Jenny read the story backward. She finished. She threw up. It was purple. All right. Chapter 18, The Substitute. Benjamin couldn't take it any longer. Today was the day he would finally tell Miss Jewell his real name. So what if nobody likes him? He thought. So what if I stop getting high marks? "Hi, Mark," said Jason. "Hi, Mark," said Stephen. Hi, he glumly replied, then started up the stairs. "Hi, Mark," said Bibi as he took the seat next to her. "Guess what? We have a substitute." "Yahoo!" shouted Mauricia. Everyone in Mrs. Jewell's class loved it when they had substitute teachers. They loved playing mean and horrible tricks on them. Benjamin frowned. He finally had the courage to tell Mrs. Jewell his real name. "Rats," he said. "That's a good idea," said Terrence. "We'll put a dead rat in her desk. Let's trick her into going outside, then lock her out of the room." "But what if she tells Mr. Kidswater?" said Eric Fry. "So what?" said Joy. "She'll have to go all the way down to the office and all the way back up. By then, we'll unlock the door. Mr. Kidswater will think she's bonkers." Benjamin looked at the substitute teacher sitting at Mrs. Jewell's desk. She looked like a nice lady. She wore tiny spectacles, which are just glasses, and he felt sorry for himself. "I was going to tell Mrs. Jewell my name," he thought. "I really was." The substitute stood up and walked to the center of the room. "Good morning," she said. "My name is Mrs. Franklin." Nobody said good morning back to her. Calvin handed Benjamin a note that said, "At 10 o'clock, drop your book on the floor. Pass it on." Benjamin read it and passed it to Todd. "Okay, who can tell me what page we're on?" asked Mrs. Franklin. "Page 17, called Myron. 112, said Mauricia. 98, said Eric Evans. 3,000, said Joe. Mrs. Franklin smiled. "I guess we'll have to study all of those pages," she said. Benjamin raised his hand. "Yes, the handsome young man in the red shirt," said the substitute. He told her the correct page. "We are on page 102, he said. "Thank you, and what is your name, please?" Benjamin thought a moment. He looked around the room, then boldly told the truth. "My name is Benjamin," he stated proudly. Several kids snickered. "Thank you, Benjamin," said the substitute. There were more snickers. "You're welcome," said Benjamin. He felt good, even if the other kids were laughing at him. Mrs. Franklin asked a question from page 102. Jason answered it correctly. Very good, said the substitute. And what is your name, please? Jason looked around. Benjamin, he asserted. Half of the class giggled. Thank you, Benjamin, said Mrs. Franklin. The other half giggled again. Dana answered the next question. And what is your name? Mrs. Franklin asked Dana. Benjamin, Dana blurted, then fell giggling onto the floor. Thank you, Benjamin, said the substitute. Everyone was hysterical. My, it is certainly a pleasure to teach such happy students. Who knows the answer to question 4? They all raised their hands. They all wanted to tell the substitute their names were Benjamin. They were having so much fun they forgot to drop their books at 10 o'clock. At recess, everyone congratulated Benjamin on his great trick. You're a genius, Mark, said Todd. Benjamin is a funny name. How'd you ever think of that? But my name really is Benjamin, said Benjamin. So is mine, said Stephen. Mine too, said Leslie. They all laughed. Do you think she really believes we are all named Benjamin? Asked Eric Evans. Probably, said Joyce. She's so stupid. Not very nice thing to say. If she thought we were lying, she would have gotten mad, said Eric Bacon. The bell rang and they all hurried back to class. After recess was social studies. Who would like to read? Asked Mrs. Franklin. Every hand went up. Okay, Benjamin. Everybody laughed. Dana giggled a few seconds, then got control of herself and read from the book. Thank you, Benjamin. Okay, Benjamin, you may read next. She was pointing to Terrence. Everybody laughed again. It was the first time all year Terrence had volunteered to read. All day, everyone paid very close attention. They all wanted the teacher to call on them, because as funny as it was when Mrs. Franklin called somebody else Benjamin, it was even funnier when she called you Benjamin. So everybody worked hard and listened closely. As a result, they learned more from the substitute in a day than they usually learned from Mrs. Jules in an entire month. When the final bell rang, everyone crowded around her desk. Are you coming back tomorrow, Mrs. Franklin, said Eric Bacon. Please, Mrs. Franklin, say you will, pleaded Kathy. You're the best substitute teacher we've ever had, said Jason. The substitute smiled. School is over, she said. You don't have to call me Miss Franklin anymore. That sounds so formal. Since we're friends now, you can call me by my first name. What is your first name? Asked Mauricia. The substitute gathered up her things and put them in a straw bag. Benjamin, she said, then walked out of the room. Everyone stared silently after her. Do you think that's really her name? Think about it. Benjamin Franklin. All right, guys. Last chapter. I have a meeting soon, so I got to make sure. Okay, I can get through it. All right. A bad case of the sillies. Allison started up the stairs 5 minutes before the bell rang for school to start. The stairs were completely empty. Allison liked it that way. When the bell rang, the stairs would become crammed with 1,000 screaming kids scurrying to their rooms, but now it was nice and peaceful. She walked up past the 18th story and towards the 20th. There was no 19th story in Wayside School. Miss Zarvis taught that class on the 19th, and there is no Miss Zarvis. Allison didn't understand it. If there was no 19th story, then wasn't her class really on the 29th story? Suddenly, she heard footsteps charging up behind her. She turned around to see Ron and Dee Dee racing. She leaned against the wall to get out of their way, but Dee Dee stamped on her foot. Then Ron's elbow jammed her in the stomach. Ugh! She grunted as she fell and rolled down 3 steps. Dee Dee and Ron didn't even stop to say they were sorry. Allison slowly stood up. Fortunately, she wasn't hurt, but her windbreaker was torn. She thought Ron and Dee Dee were silly. They raced up the stairs, and then when they got to Mrs. Jewls' room, they were too pooped to learn anything. Allison thought all the kids in Mrs. Jewls' class were silly, even Rondi, and Rondi was her best friend. Then there was Jason, who was always pestering her. That was because Jason hated her, or maybe he loved her. Allison wasn't sure. When she got to class, Dee Dee and Ron were sitting with their heads flat on their desk and their tongues hanging out. You could have said you were sorry, Allison said. As she walked past them, she sat straight up in her chair, folded her hands on her desk, and waited as everyone else wandered in. Jason entered the room carrying a glass bowl with a goldfish swimming inside of it. Look what I brought, he said. What's the name of your goldfish? Asked Mrs. Jewls. Shark, said Jason. Everyone laughed. Allison rolled her eyes. It makes him feel important, Jason explained. Where should I put him? How about on top of our coat closet, suggested Mrs. Jewls. Jason had to stand on a chair on his tippy toes. He held the bowl at the very bottom as he tried to nudge it over the edge of the closet. Suddenly, the chair toppled over. Ah! Gulp! Jason fell on the floor. He was holding the bowl upside down above his wet face. Mrs. Jules hurried to the back of the room. "Quick, somebody fill the bowl with water," he said. "Where's Shark?" Jason made a face. "I swallowed him." The class went crazy. What a show-off, thought Allison. That's kind of like our book, Something Fishy, with that book club. Mrs. Jules rang her cowbell and told everybody to settle down. "You have a bad case of the sillies this morning," she said. She took roll. "Who's absent?" she asked. "Allison," said Rondi. "Very funny, Rondi," said Allison. "Anybody else besides Allison?" asked Mrs. Jules. "I'm here, Mrs. Jules," said Allison. She sat behind Eric Fry, so she thought Mrs. Jules couldn't see her. Eric Fry was the biggest kid in class. "Just Allison," said Mrs. Jules. She marked it on her green roll card. "Damien, will you please take the roll card to the office?" Allison stood up. "I am not absent," she said. Damien took the roll card downstairs. "Mrs. Jules, did you just mark me absent?" Mrs. Jules didn't answer her. Allison marched to her desk. "Mrs. Jules, did you mark me absent?" she asked again. Mrs. Jules looked up. "Terrence, what are you whispering about?" "Nothing," mumbled Terrence. "If you can say it to Jenny, you can say it to me." "Get off my case, buzzard face," said Terrence. "Terrence!" exclaimed Mrs. Jules. "Go write your name on the blackboard under the word discipline." "But that's what I said to Jenny," Terrence protested. "Mrs. Jules, what about me?" demanded Allison. Mrs. Jules continued to ignore Allison. Allison screamed as loud as she could. Mrs. Jules didn't hear it. Allison faced the class. "Can anybody see me?" she asked. Nobody answered her. "Rondi, Dana, Jason!" "This isn't funny, guys," said Allison. "I know you're all just pretending." She stood right in front of the Jason, leaned over his desk, and stared him right in the face. "I know you can see me. You're trying not to laugh," she said. He stared right through her. She stuck out her tongue at him. He leaned forward, causing Allison's tongue to lick his nose. "Yuck!" she exclaimed, then wiped her tongue on her sleeve. Mrs. Jules began the morning lesson. "Have you all gone crazy?" shouted Allison. She ran out of the room and down to the class to the 29th story. "Come quick," she said. "There's something wrong with Mrs. Jules' class." No one heard her. She slammed the door, then continued down the stairs to the 28th floor. No one saw her there either. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "Is this whole school playing a joke on me?" she wondered. "It's not funny," she shouted as loud as she could. She continued down the stairs, screaming anything that came to her head, hoping that someone's or somewhere would notice her. "Fish for sale! Fresh fish! Fat fish! Get your fresh fat fish!" A tall, skinny lady with very short hair stepped out of one of the rooms. "Shh!" she whispered. "This is a school, not a fish market." "You can hear me?" asked Allison. She was so happy she wanted to hug her. "Yes, I can hear you," the woman said sternly. "My whole class can hear you. You're making it impossible for us to get any work done." "I'm sorry," said Allison, "but something's wrong in Mrs. Jules' class." "You better come in here," said the teacher. Allison followed the teacher into her classroom. "What's your name?" the teacher asked her. "Allison." "Boys and girls, this is Allison," the teacher announced to her students. "She'll be joining our class." "What?" said Allison. But... "My name is Miss Zarvis. Welcome to the 19th story." Bum, bum, bum. All right, guys. Hope you have an awesome afternoon. Bye.